En tant que travailliste, souvent, l'entreprise et l'employeur est la source du problème. Et en tant que citoyen de la Terre, on peut voir que les entreprises font souvent partie aussi du problème. Alors, dans cet atelier, dans ce forum, l'idée, c'est de voir, peut-on réformer l'entreprise? Et nous avons 4 points de vue extrêmement différents, complémentaires d'une certaine façon, nous verrons laquelle, et 4 propositions très fortes sur quel est l'avenir de l'entreprise ou quelle entreprise de l'avenir devrions-nous avoir? Qu'est-ce que nous devons faire comme réforme? Alors, je vais vous les présenter un par un juste avant leur interprétation. Alors, la première personne va être très bonne pour nous dire ce qui ne va pas. C'est le professeur Joel Bakan, qui est professeur de droit à l'Université de Colombie-Britannique, spécialiste du droit corporatif, juriste de renommée internationale. Il a entre autres écrit en 2003 un livre qui s'appelle The Corporation, The Pathological Pursuit of Profit and Power, publié dans plus de 20 langues, devenu un best-seller dans plusieurs pays et ensuite un documentaire réalisé par Mark Arkbar et Jennifer Abbott. Nombreux prix pour le film, celui du meilleur documentaire étranger au Festival de films de Sundance, par exemple, succès critique au box-office pour un documentaire de droit corporatif. En plus des prix pour ses livres et ses films, professeur Bakan a été nommé en 2004 professeur universitaire de Colombie-Britannique de l'année. Son dernier livre, The New Corporation, How Good Corporations Are Bad for Democracy, paru en 2020, est une critique implacable des tentatives par les sociétés par action d'améliorer leur impact sur les sociétés au moyen de la responsabilité sociale. Professeur Bakan, you need the mic.
Thank you. What should we do? So, so I'll talk a little bit about what we shouldn't do, and then in the next round of comments, I'll talk about what we should do. And the name of the book, in English, anyways, it's a sequel to The Corporation, and there's a film as well called The New Corporation. How good corporations are bad for democracy. And I think that subtitle probably sums up what you're going to hear from me. The question of the roundtable, is there a roadmap to common good capitalism? My short answer is no, I don't think so. And it's not that I don't think it's possible to protect and promote the common good within and from capitalism. But that's a very different question than whether we can expect capitalism itself to foster the common good. Because when we attach the modifier ism to the word capital, what we signal is that creating capital for capitalists becomes the overarching telos of the system we describe. Which means that if we want to protect and promote the common good, workers, the environment, communities, as was stated in the prompt, we cannot really rely on capital with its capitalism, with its fundamental imperative to create capital for capitalists. We need instead to rely on other values and protect other interests, which means we have to limit capital creation to the extent, and it's a large extent currently, that it operates by exploiting and extracting from human beings in the natural environment. So that's capitalism. What I want to do now is turn to the capitalist firm. I only have 8 minutes here. So, and beginning with the fact that I think is obvious that the mega corporations, the financial institutions that dominate global capitalism today are, for the most part, legally mandated and culturally disposed to be capitalist in the sense I just described, to prioritize above all else the creation of capital for capitalists, which means that other values and interests, such as the environment, workers, communities, are external to their legitimate concerns, and they're viewed as things not to protect, but rather as resources to exploit and extract from, so-called externalities. Understood in this way, the capitalist corporation seems quite monstrous. Indeed, I've likened it to a psychopath in my work, which is probably why, beginning in the early 2000s, You know, people were in the streets, the anti-globalization protests, Occupy followed that, the 2008 crisis, and business leaders and their allies started to recraft the corporation's image, to reimagine it as distinctively non-psychopathic, as other regarding, very Kantian, as caring, as capable of prioritizing social and environmental values, not only its own and owners' financial self-interest. So this new corporation, as I describe it in the book and film of that name, has become the key player in ESG and related movements: stakeholder capitalism, inclusive capitalism, conscientious capitalism, shared value capitalism, and all those other kinds of warm and fuzzy capitalisms, all of which propose that corporations can and should prioritize protecting human beings, the natural environment, not just exploiting and extracting from them, which is a really charming idea, which I argue in my work is kind of like the notorious charm of the psychopath. It's profoundly deceptive and dangerous. And that's not because corporations can't sometimes talk and act as though the common good matters. They can, and they do. But they can only do so in ways that strategically aim to fulfill their self-interested mandates. And that's a legal imperative. In other words, they can do good, but they have to do it as a means to do well, not as an end in itself. And within that logic, they can do bad, which not infrequently they do, when doing bad rather than doing good is the best means for doing well. So long as doing well is the end, well, you can see where that goes. So for these reasons, doing good is always limited, it's always uncertain, it's always unreliable, and doing bad will inevitably be relied upon to mask and cultivate the appearance of doing good. And so that's one danger that attaches to the new corporation, the danger of deception. But there's another, and I think more profound danger, and that is the way the new corporation is serving ideologically to fuel the magnification of corporate power and impunity, the consequential corrosion of democracy that we associate with neoliberalism. When corporations are moralized, as these trends do, presented as caring and conscientious, they appear as capable of regulating themselves. So you can do away with regulation. Deregulation is fine. They seem capable of caring, of being caring and reliable providers of public goods, like healthcare or schools or water. And so you can continue and legitimate privatization. And more broadly, when corporations are presented in these ways as trustworthy leaders in finding solutions to the world's problems, to climate change, poverty, gender and racial inequality, the ensuing logic is that they can be relied upon to govern society more and be governed by society less. When, for the project I was talking about, I interviewed Richard Edelman, arguably the world's most influential business guru. I interviewed him at Davos at the World Economic Forum of all places. And he told me that corporations have become, quote, agents for change, and that they therefore could, and this is a direct quote from that interview, which is in the film, The New Corporation, they could, quote, fill voids left by government, close quote. Fill voids left by government, which of course raises the question, and I asked him this as a follow-up, shouldn't we be worried about that rather than celebrating it? Corporations filling voids left by government, isn't that a problem for democracy? To which he responded tellingly and chillingly, quote, I'm not much of a believer in political citizenship. I actually believe much more in the power of the marketplace. And he's one of the good guys of contemporary capitalism. So that frank admission by Edelman really captures my worry that the new corporation and related movements are putting a smiling face on neoliberalism's overarching imperative, which is, as Quinn Slobodian describes it, to, quote, immunize capital from the threat of democracy. I'm cognizant of time. I just got the sign. And so I'll save my thoughts about solutions, what needs to be done, but I think you can deduce from what I've said that they're not going to be found in voluntary and benevolent initiatives of for-profit corporations. So I'll save that for the next round of comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Notre prochain interlocuteur a dévoué sa vie au dialogue syndical, mais maintenant, il prend un repos au Sénat. Non, ce n'est pas un repos. Un repos du combat syndical. Oui, non, c'est pas très bon. Pardonnez-moi. Alors, l'honorable Hassan Yussuff est sénateur au Sénat du Canada depuis 2021. Après, je disais, une longue carrière syndicale qui l'a mené notamment à être président du Congrès canadien du travail. Il a reçu avec ses partenaires le prix de la liberté d'association au Canada en 2021. À titre de sénateur, il a siégé, entre autres, au groupe consultatif pour la carboneutralité mis en place par le gouvernement fédéral pour conseiller le ministre de l'Environnement et du Changement climatique sur les moyens d'atteindre la carboneutralité d'ici 2050. Ça avance. Il a récemment été lauréat du prix Leadership du Centre Pearson pour des politiques progressistes. Il s'est également vu décerner des doctorats honorifiques en droit de la Brock University et de la Ryerson University. Et pour nous, il est aussi derrière et il pourra nous parler plus longuement de son implication du Sustainable Jobs Act ou de la loi sur les emplois durables. Le long titre de la loi concernant la responsabilité, la transparence et la mobilisation à l'appui de la création d'emplois durables pour les travailleurs et de la croissance économique dans une économie carboneutre. À vous la parole.
Merci. Thank you so much for inviting me, and I should thank Gregor for reaching out to ask me to be here. I wanted to be here for many reasons, because I think that the question that we've been asked to answer, as my friend has clearly stated, I think the answer is no, but I also think there's maybe a maybe. And the maybe comes with what can government do to hold corporations accountable, if they're prepared to. So I would quickly digress. Bill C-50 came about as a result of desire to deal with challenge of climate. And the government made a decision that we're going to phase out coal electricity generation throughout the country by 2030. But when they made the announcement, they didn't consult with workers as to how they were going to be impacted by it. So we were very much engaged in keeping some pressure on the government. So this is endeavor we actually support. The Congress was very much involved in the climate conference in Paris, and equally we've been having this ongoing debate at our convention for quite some time about how do we deal with the climate challenges. And so we took on the issue to say that if you're going to phase out coal electricity generation, the majority of workers, over 90% of all of the facility across the country, were unionized, including the people who mine the coal to get it into the generation facility, that you have to find a way to figure out how you're going to address the workers' interests and the community interests. And in absence of doing that, then we're not going to cooperate with you simply making a unilateral decision. So the government did establish a task force to do this. And once they did that, the minister had called me and says, well, for all your blabbering, now we're going to ask you to chair the task force. I thought, holy shit. That's not what my intention was, but I had to change my schedule, any long and short. All the unions were there. We had environmental organization and others. So we went across the country in Alberta, Saskatchewan, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia to talk to workers, to the employers. Some of them are state-owned enterprise. Another place, they're private enterprise, to talk about how we're going to achieve this objective. Long and short, we did write a report to lay out a foundation how the government should go about this. But in that, it was a very, I think, descriptive piece of legislation that we were asking for. As a result of that, of course, did I know I was going to be in the Senate. The government did draft a bill, which became Bill C-50, that ended up in the Senate. And I ended up sponsoring the bill. But before the bill got to the Senate, I have to confess that the bill had a lot of flaws in it. And I said if it came to the Senate and I was the sponsor, the bill would not survive, it would get defeated. So the government took the advice and amended the bill. But they lay out some foundation, which I don't think, despite the state responsibility to workers and community, has ever been more than lip service. So we thought we had to get something more concrete. So it talks about sustainability, accountability, transparency, dialogue, inclusion, and how we're also going to create decent work. Because I think the challenge we face as humanity in dealing with the climate challenge is real, can't be ignored. And workers have a fundamental responsibility to be leading in this effort and to be in the forefront advocating what can be done. I think in absence of legislation, we're not likely to get anywhere because voluntary measures so far haven't worked, and I don't believe it's going to work. So government have a responsibility. I was part of the Net Zero Advisory Committee recognizing by 2050, we set some target as a government and a country that we want to achieve, and we're not going to get there either unless we figure out what the economic plan of the country is going to look like, because many things will change. And the way we do things today is not going to be the way we're going to do it forward. Work will change in a dramatic way if we care about the planet. And again, I think workers have a leading role today. So the bill lays out the foundation that has to be done. And I will be very quick and descriptive. It create a structure where workers are going to co-chair this council. They will have representative along with other groups, and is to produce a report laying out the foundation, how it's going to achieve. And then in addition to that, of course, how the dialogue will happen with Indigenous people and others. They have to produce a plan. We also recognize there would have to be somebody in the government responsible for this work, because too often in government, they say, yeah, the government, you file a report, and then we find out nobody's responsible. So we're very detailed, and if you read the legislation as it's laid out, because it's now passed, it's now the law, and it got royal assent, it lays out the foundation I think could be a model for how we deal with sustainability. Now, the question is, can corporations be responsible for social dialogue and human rights? I think there's enough evidence, without me cluttering, to say that corporations only care about one thing, it's profit. And as much as you might hear nice, beautiful words about sustainability and about human rights, most of what the UN, the Global Compact, could produce has been a farce. And I'll bring it to the last point. The Rana Plaza collapse in Bangladesh, we all remember that. Thousands of workers died and got injured in the process of that collapse. And the world was angry. Most people were angry, consumers are angry, and thought we could do something. But the efforts that came about as a result of the Rana Plaza collapse was mostly voluntary. And while it's been some time since those voluntary measures were put in place, corporations' behavior hasn't changed very much, despite what happened in that. So I think it speaks volume for the effort that government have to take responsibility for if we want to live in a sustainable planet, if we want to respect human rights. And as I speak to you, if you talk to the Uyghurs in China, they will tell you that the product they produce are sold in the marketplace in their own country, use of forced labor, despite the fact that this is not supposed to happen in 2024. So I said maybe to begin to this question, and I said maybe if you have strong legislation that can be enforced and held accountable with workers having a voice in that process, you might be able to shift the pendulum in a small way that could make a difference. I think for our country, Canada and others, is that for the trade union movement, I think they have to play a significant role in this effort if we're going to shift the dialogue, because history has shown us all these nice things have been talked about for many, many, many years. And here we are, and we're still struggling with the basic principle about decent work with respect for human rights, respect for gender equality. And the progress we have made, while we have made some progress, have been very slow. So I'll stop there. The legislation for me is a long process to try to do something meaningful in the context of giving worker a voice, and it represents, I think, one part of the long evolution of work that we still have to do in the question how we hold corporations accountable for their responsibility and behavior, not only in our own country, but internationally at the same time.
Alors, corporations only care about one thing, profit. And maybe with strong legislation, they can be made to change. Le prochain interlocuteur est Jérôme Lussier, directeur des affaires parlementaires pour la sénatrice Julie Miville-Dechêne depuis 2021 et pour quelques minutes encore. Ardent défenseur d'une transition économique vers un modèle d'entreprise plus durable, éthique qui profite à tout le monde, il a épaulé la sénatrice dans le dépôt de son projet de loi sur l'entreprise du 21e siècle, le projet de loi S-285, actuellement en deuxième lecture au Sénat. Ça, c'est du point de vue d'une juriste qui a fait son doctorat sur le désir des sociétés d'être simplement occupées par leur profit, ben, c'est révolutionnaire comme projet de loi. C'est strong legislation, une loi dure qui obligerait les entreprises à se préoccuper d'autre chose que le profit, mais je vais laisser Jérôme le présenter. Avant d'occuper ce poste, il a travaillé comme directeur des politiques au cabinet de l'opposition officielle à l'Assemblée nationale du Québec, cofondateur de la plateforme Vaste Programme, un site web lancé en 2022 qui accueille les billets d'opinion de diverses personnalités publiques pour favoriser la réflexion et les échanges d'idées. Il a travaillé comme avocat en droit des affaires et en litige à New York et à Montréal, bachelier de l'Université McGill, maîtrise en journalisme de l'Université Concordia. Columbia, oui, Columbia, it's a kind of the difference, et diplômé en droit de l'Université McGill.
Merci. Je vais parler français, but I just wanted to quickly acknowledge that Professor Bakan's movie, The Corporation, which I saw in New York City over 20 years ago, is a direct source of inspiration for this bill. So everything is connected. It is the truth. Je vais parler français, donc. Je n'ai pas de remarques préparées, mais j'ai réfléchi à mes affaires un peu. J'aimerais dire quatre remarques initiales avant de parler de façon un petit peu plus précise du projet de loi S-285. La première, c'est que je suis, comme mes co-panélistes, absolument d'accord, non seulement d'un point de vue théorique, mais d'un point de vue pratique, c'est-à-dire comme quelqu'un qui a effectivement travaillé comme avocat en droit des affaires, travaillé à la Caisse de dépôt, et qui donc a vu et constaté dans la pratique que le seul véritable objectif de l'entreprise privée, c'est la recherche de profit, parfois maquillée de façon opportuniste, mais à la fin de la journée, pour utiliser un anglicisme, c'est ça qui compte. Donc, absolument, ça, c'est le point de départ. La deuxième chose que je dirais, pour endosser les remarques du sénateur Hassan, c'est que sans législation forte, on n'arrivera à rien. Les initiatives volontaires donnent très, très peu de résultats, selon moi. Je peux même vous dire que j'ai personnellement quitté la Caisse de dépôt où je jouais un rôle d'ambassadeur des initiatives climatiques parce qu'à un certain moment, j'ai senti que les actions ne suivaient pas toujours les paroles. Par contre, j'ai une différence peut-être avec M. Bakan à côté, dans le sens où je pense que les gouvernements ne peuvent pas tout faire. Et quand je dis ça, ce n'est pas pour dire que je pense que c'est l'entreprise privée qui doit occuper les espaces vides nécessairement, mais que les défis auxquels l'humanité fait face sont trop grands pour espérer que le secteur public et les gouvernements puissent tout faire. Là, pour le coup, si je mets mon chapeau de personne qui a travaillé en politique à Québec et à Ottawa depuis 5 ans ou plus, ce n'est pas de la mauvaise volonté, mais il y a toutes sortes de contraintes structurelles et autres qui font que les gouvernements ont une capacité d'action limitée, limitée dans les moyens, limitée dans la marge de manœuvre politique, limitée aussi, je dirais, par des processus qui ont peut-être leur raison d'être parfois, mais qui sont habituellement lourds et peu réactifs et difficilement adaptables à toutes les situations. L'entreprise privée, le secteur privé, il faut le reconnaître, a une agilité, une capacité d'innover qui est remarquable. Et c'est un peu une des sources d'inspiration aussi pour le projet de loi. J'avais une quatrième remarque, je l'ai oubliée, donc je vais parler du projet de loi. Donc, oui, non, ma dernière remarque, en fait, présente le projet de loi. Il y a plusieurs façons de penser à l'évolution des initiatives de responsabilité sociale ou environnementale des entreprises. Ça fait très longtemps, j'ai déjà écrit là-dessus, les années 70 avec les Sullivan Principles, puis les campagnes de désinvestissement en Afrique du Sud et tout. Donc, ce n'est pas d'hier qu'on essaie d'encadrer l'activité corporative pour l'aligner sur des préoccupations des valeurs sociales ou environnementales. Mais si on fait une analogie que certains n'aimeront pas, mais avec la maladie et physique, et qu'on fait une analogie que les tensions entre l'action des entreprises, l'action corporative est comme cette tension-là est une maladie socio-économique, si on veut. Euh, j'ai l'impression qu'on a toujours cherché à s'attaquer aux symptômes plutôt qu'à s'attaquer à la cause profonde. On a cherché, via la réglementation, la législation de toutes sortes, à stopper certaines pratiques polluantes, certaines pratiques d'entreprise au niveau du travail qui posaient des problèmes. On a établi des barèmes, des limites. On a réglementé toutes sortes d'aspects de l'activité corporative. Même la fiscalité joue ce rôle-là jusqu'à un certain point. Mais on n'a jamais vraiment attaqué ce qui, pour moi, est un des cœurs du problème, qui est l'ADN de la gestion de l'entreprise. Et cet ADN-là, je l'ai toujours abordé de façon plutôt juridique, c'est les obligations fiduciaires des administrateurs et des dirigeants de l'entreprise qui, tant dans la loi telle qu'écrite que dans la jurisprudence, consacrent vraiment, je dirais même particulièrement dans les juridictions de common law, plus qu'en droit civil, mais véritablement, le droit consacre la primauté de l'intérêt propre, le meilleur intérêt de l'entreprise sur toute autre considération, qui peuvent être prises en compte. Mais, comme le disait le professeur Bakan, c'est seulement de manière dérivée. Donc, les dirigeants d'entreprise peuvent tenir compte de l'environnement, des enjeux sociaux, mais l'impact de cette prise en compte-là se limite à agir dans ce qui constitue le meilleur intérêt de l'entreprise. Et cet article-là, l'article de loi qui consacre ça, vous pouvez aller le voir, c'est l'article 122 de la loi canadienne sur les sociétés par action. Alors, il y a quelques années déjà, on a décidé, moi en grande partie, avec la sénatrice Miville-Dechêne, avec qui je travaille, de s'attaquer au cœur du problème et donc de travailler en partie sur la base d'un modèle qui existe au Royaume-Uni, qui s'appelle le Better Business Act, de s'attaquer de façon assez chirurgicale à ce problème en amendant l'article 122 de la loi canadienne sur les sociétés par action pour redéfinir de façon, je pense, oui, révolutionnaire, les obligations fiduciaires des administrateurs et dirigeants d'entreprise, de telle sorte que le meilleur intérêt de l'entreprise demeure, parce que forcément, ces gens gèrent une entreprise et doivent donc agir dans son intérêt, mais pour dire que la poursuite de cet intérêt-là doit aussi se faire dans une perspective d'impacts sociaux et environnementaux positifs. Et donc, ces obligations-là deviennent indissociables les unes des autres. Et j'aurai peut-être l'occasion d'en parler, mais la loi comprend aussi des mécanismes de reddition de comptes. Un, qui est la publication de rapports d'impact et pas des rapports de risque, très différents, et des moyens d'action plus clairs pour des parties prenantes qui voudraient entreprendre des actions obliques contre des entreprises qui manqueraient à ces obligations élargies. Voilà. C'est ce projet de loi S-285.
On voit que c'est captivant quand les gens n'ont pas envie d'applaudir juste pour qu'on continue à parler. Alors, on va continuer dans la réforme avec le professeur Isabelle Ferreras, professeure à l'Université catholique de Louvain, instigatrice avec Dominique Méda et Julie Battiliana du manifeste Travail démocratisé, démarchandisé, dépollué, paru en 2020 dans 42 journaux, signé par plus de 3000 signataires, mais on doit avoir dépassé ces chiffres-là, rassemblant des universitaires de 600 universités à travers le monde. Elle prône l'avènement d'une entreprise bicamérale, deux chambres, le Sénat et la Chambre des communes, mais dans l'entreprise, pour inclure les travailleuses et travailleurs dans le gouvernement de l'entreprise. Elle a été nommée par le gouvernement belge au Haut Comité scientifique pour une transition juste, élue membre titulaire de l'Académie royale de Belgique en 2017. Madame Ferreras est maître de recherche du Fonds de recherche scientifique en Belgique, associée de recherche senior au Center for Labor and Just Economy de l'Université Harvard, et elle a reçu un doctorat honoris causa de l'Université Laval.
Merci beaucoup, Isabelle. So I also should start with a tribute to Joel, whom I heard. That's probably 15 years ago, thanks to Elaine Bernard in Cambridge, Massachusetts, presenting the documentary. So that is a note to say that long-term work in academia works. Je vais parler en français également. Donc, merci beaucoup pour cette invitation de l'Institut Penner à mener ce débat aujourd'hui. J'aimerais apporter ma contribution en commençant par la démocratie, pour dire que la démocratie, c'est un régime politique que nous donnons dans certaines sociétés, le Canada en tout cas, je pense, et un régime politique qui vise à nous gouverner en raison de notre reconnaissance, de notre égalité en dignité, en droit. Et c'est un idéal, on le sait, on est loin du compte, mais cet idéal infuse la vie politique. De notre côté, nous vivons avec le capitalisme. Et le capitalisme, je pense qu'on le comprend mieux quand on comprend qu'il s'agit aussi d'un régime politique. C'est un régime politique qui, lui, n'est pas fondé sur la reconnaissance de notre égale dignité, mais qui est fondé sur la distribution des droits politiques de gouverner à ceux qui apportent du capital. Et les citoyens dans le capitalisme, les seuls qui comptent, ce sont ceux qui apportent du capital. Et pour cette raison-là, la société anonyme, qui a fait l'objet de l'intérêt de Joel et qui est vraiment le cœur de notre passion commune aujourd'hui, la société anonyme, c'est l'institution centrale du capitalisme. Je pense que c'est un point, une note, mais je crois que c'est très important de mesurer que dans la pensée progressiste, à gauche, on a mis beaucoup d'énergie à penser le marché. Et le marché pose évidemment plein de problèmes, mais on n'a pas assez pensé la société anonyme. Et la société anonyme, je me réjouis qu'elle soit le cœur de notre panel aujourd'hui, parce qu'elle doit être vraiment au cœur de la réflexion d'un réseau de recherche comme le CRIMT. La société anonyme, qu'est-ce qu'elle fait? Eh bien, par design, by design, elle est extractiviste. Elle est extractiviste puisqu'elle entretient une relation avec tout ce qui n'est pas son intérêt propre, c'est-à-dire ceux qui ont apporté du capital dans l'aventure économique. Eh bien, tout cela sont considérés comme des ressources potentielles pour sa grande ambition, grande ou petite. Donc, il y a les ressources humaines qui sont nous, les humains, qui vont investir en travail dans l'aventure économique. Il y a les ressources dites naturelles, qui sont la planète et tous les vivants sur cette terre, autres que humains. Et donc, si on veut que la société anonyme produise autre chose que ce qu'elle est programmée pour produire, par design, effectivement, je suis tout à fait alignée avec mes autres panélistes. Il est certain il va falloir changer le design de l'entreprise. On ne va jamais s'en sortir avec l'entreprise telle qu'elle est aujourd'hui, structurée autour de la société anonyme. Ça, c'est pour offrir une réponse. Évidemment, je ne pense pas que le capitalisme puisse... on ne peut pas sauver la planète et la démocratie avec le capitalisme. Il va falloir changer l'institution cœur du capitalisme, c'est-à-dire la société anonyme. Alors, j'aimerais donner 2 exemples ici pour voir comment les entreprises se perçoivent, parce que je pense qu'il y a beaucoup à en apprendre. Et là, j'ai sans doute une vision un peu différente de la vision de l'entreprise comme psychopathe, bien que ce soit extrêmement évocateur, évidemment. Je pense dans la caractérisation de la logique de la société anonyme, dans son rapport justement à ses ressources. Mais aujourd'hui, comment les entreprises se perçoivent? Eh bien, regardons Meta, par exemple. Meta, en 2016, a créé un poste de VP pour les affaires publiques. Vous vous souvenez, c'est le vice-premier ministre britannique, Nick Clegg, qui a été embauché par Meta pour devenir le VP Affaires publiques et qui a déployé un réseau de diplomatie dans le monde avec véritablement des ambassadeurs, toute une diplomatie pour Meta dans le monde. En 2019, Meta a mis sur pied un Oversight Board, en fait une sorte de Cour suprême à qui Meta confie et a très bien fait un très beau design de séparation des pouvoirs. Il y a des professeurs d'université qui sont nommés comme juges, en quelque sorte, sur ce Oversight Board et qui statuent sur des questions de modération qui se passent sur le réseau Facebook. Et Meta donc consulte et puis met en œuvre et respecte cette indépendance. En 2023-24, Meta a mis en place des deliberative polls avec 8000 usagers, oh my God, pour prendre le pouls de ces usagers. Tout ce qu'on voit là, à mon sens, et j'avais tout un développement sous les critères ESG dont je vais vous épargner, qui sont une autre manière, pas au niveau d'une entreprise, mais au niveau de la finance, de, en fait, à mon avis, saisir la critique politique de l'entreprise, c'est-à-dire le fait que tous, nous savons ici, tous les citoyens, les citoyennes de tous les pays du monde ont bien compris qu'on avait affaire là à des entités politiques qui ont un pouvoir de gouverner la vie de leurs travailleurs au quotidien et la vie de la société plus généralement. Si on parle d'IA, eh bien, tout le monde sent ça. Donc, les attentes sociétales sont en train de se radicaliser par rapport aux entreprises. Alors, face à des despotes, je pense qu'il faut trouver une stratégie qui va être à la hauteur de l'analyse, si vous voulez. Donc, il ne faut pas faire d'erreur dans la cible, parce qu'il faut bien saisir à quoi on a affaire. À mon sens, on a affaire donc à des entités politiques qu'il faut traiter comme nous avons traité dans l'histoire les entités politiques despotiques, c'est-à-dire des entités qui gouvernent et dont l'existence dépend de la possibilité même d'une partie constituante aujourd'hui complètement négligée, les commons, la plèbe, les travailleurs, sans lesquels ces entreprises n'existeraient tout simplement pas. Il n'y a pas de corporation Uber, par exemple, il n'y a pas de société anonyme Uber, sans qu'il y ait des dizaines, des centaines de milliers de livreurs qui vont travailler pour porter ce service. Mais pour la raison que le droit a organisé les choses comme elle l'organise, la société anonyme peut continuer à se considérer comme immune du fait qu'elle a besoin de cette partie constituante que sont l'ensemble de ces travailleurs pour exister. Donc, prolonger l'histoire, ça veut dire quoi? Ça veut dire, si vous regardez dans l'histoire comment nous avons fait ça, eh bien, depuis le 5e siècle avant Jésus-Christ, ça fait quand même longtemps, ça fait 25 siècles, le despote propriétaire, les patriciens, par exemple, à Rome, ou si vous prenez l'exemple moderne le plus clair, c'est la Chambre des Lords en Angleterre. Qu'est-ce que la Chambre des Lords? C'est vraiment les propriétaires des terres. Que trouvez-vous dans un board, dans un conseil d'administration? Vous trouvez les titulaires des parts de propriété. Et la question qui se pose devant nous, effectivement, c'est celle de la reconnaissance du droit collectif de valider ou non les décisions de gouvernement de ces entreprises qui est, est devant nous et qui donc nous appelle à considérer la représentation des investisseurs, des investisseuses en travail, ceux qui travaillent dans l'entreprise et qui ne sont pas forcément d'ailleurs reconnus par un contrat de travail, eh bien, leur reconnaissance pour gouverner l'entreprise. Je vais m'arrêter là.
Et la richesse des propositions. Vous voyez la profondeur des critiques. Et la question, c'est comment faire à venir, quels sont les défis qui viennent devant. Le sénateur Yussuff, vous avez une expérience de réussir à faire adopter un projet de loi qui comprend quand même une représentation syndicale dans un conseil du partenariat pour des emplois durables. Donc, une avancée. Jérôme, vous êtes un peu avancé. Vous avez déposé un projet de loi, mais il y a très loin. Surtout qu'un projet de loi au Sénat pour les gens qui suivent la politique canadienne avec un gouvernement qui est sous respirateur artificiel. On ne sait pas ce qui va arriver. Donc, quels sont les prochains défis? Je vous laisse. Qui veut se lancer en premier cette fois-ci? Comment aborder les prochains défis? Que faire?
Bonjour. J'ai évidemment pas toute la réponse, puis je vais être très intéressé à entendre mes copanélistes. Des pistes quand même. Euh, si on parle réellement de progrès tangibles, donc je pense que la question, à moins que je l'ai mal comprise, soit vraiment sur comment on fait avancer les choses concrètement dans la loi et pas uniquement dans des colloques, tout intéressant soit-il. Alors, il faut prendre acte des défis. Il y en a plusieurs. Il y en a un que je trouve intéressant et peut-être controversé jusqu'à un certain point, mais c'est qu'il faut, à mon avis, rattacher ces initiatives-là véritablement au bien commun. Et ce que je veux dire par là, c'est créer des bases de soutien politique très, très larges. Euh, Quand on présente des initiatives de réforme de la gouvernance des entreprises de façon soit idéologiquement pointue ou très caractérisée comme visant certains, le mot qui me vient en anglais, c'est constituencies, tu sais, des parties prenantes très précises, on réduit d'emblée l'appel, l'appui politique pour ces choses-là parce que ça semble soudain des initiatives nichées, politiquement orientées, qui ont de la misère à trouver des appuis politiques larges. J'ai en tête une formule très efficace, selon moi, qui a été mise de l'avant par un ex-juge du Delaware aux États-Unis qui s'appelle Leo Strine. Je sais pas, bon, à qui j'ai parlé plusieurs fois dans les dernières années en lien avec notre projet de loi, qui l'appuie d'ailleurs. Et lui a publié un article dans lequel il disait Making money the right way. Je trouvais qu'au plan politique, c'était d'une simplicité complètement désarmante, à tel point que c'est à peu près impossible pour qui que ce soit de s'opposer à ce principe. Et j'ai aussi été très intéressé ces dernières années par un certain discours de droite conservatrice aux États-Unis, ceux qui s'intéressent, mais des gens comme le sénateur Marco Rubio et autres, qui ont commencé à dire des choses comme People don't exist to serve the market should serve the people. Alors, venant du Parti républicain, c'est très étonnant comme discours. C'était plutôt des choses qui ont été dites à l'époque dans une perspective protectionniste, etc., de défense. Mais quand même, pour moi, il y a une base là pour ratisser plus large et sortir des sentiers battus au plan politique. Et je pense que si j'ai une première remarque à faire sur le sujet, ce serait ça. Ce serait d'essayer de trouver des façons de présenter l'enjeu qui nous occupe de telle façon que ça n'ait pas l'air d'une initiative euh, trop chargée, trop idéologiquement nichée, mais au contraire, quelque chose qui serve réellement à l'intérêt public et à laquelle il soit presque impossible de s'opposer parce que c'est le, pour citer notre Parti conservateur, le gros bon sens.
Euh, il me semble qu'en termes d'universalisme, il n'y a peut-être pas plus universel que l'aspiration de tout un chacun, toute une chacune à avoir de l'autonomie dans sa vie et à pouvoir se sentir un être libre. Et quand on voit les sondages sur les attentes des individus, les gens, en fait, ils parlent de ce besoin de pouvoir avoir un agency dans leur vie. Et là, je pense que le lien qui existe empiriquement, mais qui n'est pas encore assez connu et qui est en train de plus en plus intéresser, est un vrai levier. C'est le lien suivant, c'est le lien entre le vote pour l'extrême droite, le vote ou l'abstention, plutôt. Donc les deux, le vote pour l'extrême droite ou l'abstention, qui est maintenant, par exemple en France, qui a été démontré dans les travaux de Thomas Coutreau comme absolument lié au fait de ne pas avoir de l'autonomie au travail. Les gens qui ont le moins d'autonomie au travail, ils vont s'abstenir ou ils vont avoir un vote en fait vers des personnages forts qui vont leur dire je vais vous protéger, je vais vous sécuriser. Et donc là, je pense qu'il y a une responsabilité quand même des élites de se rendre compte. Et il y a une partie du patronat, je pense, qui est en train de bouger sur cette question. J'ai eu des débats très intéressants en France avec le président du MEDEF, qui n'est pas connu pour être une figure de gauche, qui reconnaissait tout à fait le problème et qui reconnaît qu'il y a un vrai sujet. Et là, pour le coup, une responsabilité sociétale de l'entreprise. Et donc, il me semble que le meilleur ancrage aussi qu'on peut trouver, évidemment, c'est de se faire l'écho des demandes des personnes. Et puisqu'on est dans un moment populiste, je dirais, politiquement, il me semble que d'abord les organisations syndicales, mais aussi les élites politiques devraient se saisir du fait que, deux points de chiffres, 83% des gens, dans une enquête sur 8000 personnes dans 10 pays par Kite Insight, 83% des travailleurs disent qu'en fait, ils voudraient agir sur les questions liées à la protection de l'environnement. Dans le cadre de leur travail, ils voient des choses à faire, mais ils n'ont pas le pouvoir. Ils ne peuvent pas agir. Donc, il y a une demande de pouvoir agir qui est énorme. Et d'autre part, je prendrai l'exemple du secteur de l'intelligence artificielle. Ce qu'on voit tous bien, c'est que c'est une technologie qui va transformer la vie de la société, qui va transformer le travail en particulier. Et les travailleurs eux-mêmes de cette industrie demandent d'avoir leur mot à dire. Donc, vous avez suivi ce qui s'était passé à OpenAI en novembre dernier. Sam Altman se fait virer. On a toute une enquête interne pour savoir quel a été le problème de gouvernance. Le résultat du rapport que OpenAI rend public au mois de mars pour les dysfonctionnements, c'est de dire on a trouvé le mécanisme de gouvernance d'entreprise qui va nous sauver, et c'est un whistleblower hotline. Et donc, on voit bien qu'on n'est pas du tout à la hauteur du problème qui est de traiter cette entité comme, pour ce qu'elle est, c'est une entité politique. Ce sont des mécanismes de pouvoir et de contre-pouvoir. Et du coup, en juin, je termine, en juin, le 4 juin, les travailleurs, ingénieurs de OpenAI eux-mêmes écrivent une lettre ouverte signée avec Jeff Hinton, qui est le prix Nobel de physique maintenant, qui ne l'était pas à l'époque, mais bon, qui est néanmoins extrêmement connu dans le milieu de l'IA. Et Jeff Hinton signe avec ses travailleurs. Quelle demande? la demande d'avoir des vraies possibilités pour les travailleurs de peser sur les décisions de l'entreprise. Parce que qu'est-ce qu'ils disent? En fait, ce qu'ils nous disent, c'est nous avons des intuitions critiques, éthiques très fortes sur ce que nous sommes en train de coder. Mais vu les pressions de la compétition entre entreprises et vu la structure de gouvernance de l'entreprise, nous savons que ça ne sert à rien qu'on essaye d'avoir une délibération sur ces sujets. Et donc là, il y a une responsabilité aussi, je pense, de cultiver en fait les citoyens, les travailleurs à la possibilité de traiter ce problème politiquement au sens noble, c'est-à-dire changer la structure de l'entreprise, parce que même eux n'ont même pas accès à cette idée-là. Parce que nous sommes dans un monde très fragmenté et les gens réfléchissent un peu chacun dans leur silo. Mais la demande sociale et la demande dans les entreprises, elle est là. Et donc, il faut, je pense, un peu oser aussi du côté des organisations syndicales, je pense, à aller de l'avant avec un leadership beaucoup plus audacieux et les élites politiques progressistes également. Parce que bon, tout ce qu'on court, je crois, en l'occurrence, c'est pas grand-chose. Hein. Parce que sinon, la perte de la démocratie, elle est devant nous. Donc.
Thank you. Okay, well, I'm going to speak at a fairly broad level, a principled level about political narratives that I think we have to keep in mind, but we're losing sight of. And I'll begin with the U.S. election, but not the one we're currently obsessing about. But I want to take us back to the 1930s, to Franklin Roosevelt's first run at the presidency, where in his nomination speech, he talked about what he was observing, the rise of fascism in Europe. And that's, not at all unparalleled to what we may be observing here. And he said, as he observed the rise of fascism in Italy in particular, he said that revealed two truths. And the first truth, he said, is that when people tolerate the growth of private power to a point where it becomes stronger than their democracy itself, that is, in essence, fascism. The second truth is that the liberty of a democracy is not safe if its business system does not provide employment and produce and distribute goods in such a way as to sustain an acceptable standard of living. 1930. Now, these two truths are, with some tweaks, profoundly pertinent today. In relation to the first, private economic power has grown, become concentrated, to the point it now plays an inordinate role in shaping politics, public policy. It's become, as Roosevelt feared, stronger than the democratic state itself, which I guess there are questions as to whether that means fascism. He believed it did. In relation to his second truth, neoliberalism's call for lax corporate taxes and regulation / social services privatization, anti-unionism, austerity, all of this has propelled, and it's documented, spiraling inequality, which, among other things, corrodes social solidarity and which thereby is fueling the rise of illiberal and fascist movements. So in terms of solutions, I think it's instructive to look at what Roosevelt did to address his two truths. Among other things, he promulgated broad and robust regulatory controls of corporations. He created programs to foster social security. He acted in the name of the common good. He restricted private economic power in order to promote the common good, and he made use of public mechanisms to do that. The management of economic life had to be in the hands of government, he proclaimed, not, quote, vested in any private group or cartel, however benevolent its professions profess to be, close quote. And the same is true today in the era of the new corporation and the claim that corporations have become benevolent. And as in the name of that benevolence, they're expanding their power and pushing back democratic controls. So I think the first thing we need to do from a practical perspective is outright reject this idea that putatively publicly minded firms can or should be relied upon to take the lead in protecting and promoting the common good. Second, and by way of corollary, we need to build robustly social states mandated to promote and protect the common good through regulatory and social programs, to constitute and govern markets and firms, as tools for serving the common good, not as ends in themselves. And so I think we need to work in two interconnected realms, not one or the other. First, we need to work on the firm. We need to legally reconstitute firms, embed social and environmental imperatives into their mandates. And here I salute the brilliant scholarship of Isabelle and the work that Jérôme is doing. And second, we need to orient public and democratic institutions towards robustly promoting and protecting the common good in at least two ways. And one of these Hassan is endemic of in terms of the work, exemplary of in terms of the work he's doing. We need to impose and enforce evidence-led mandatory restrictions on exploitative and harmful corporate behavior that undermines social and environmental interests and thereby the common good. And I really want to pick up on Hassan's point that these have to be concrete, not abstract, and they have to have real enforcement mechanisms, things at a very practical level, like spot inspections, for example, and then prosecutorial staff and all of that, all of the stuff that's being gutted these days on account of deregulation, not just of norms, but also of enforcement mechanisms. And secondly, again, through evidence-led laws and policies, we have to ensure that all citizens have the means to live full, healthy, and thriving lives. Thriving labor movement, healthcare, education, housing, clean environment, social security, all of that. And so I guess on a final note, all those things are how do we sort of do all of this in a political economy that remains capitalism? And I guess my final note is that we need to question whether we should move forward with that kind of political economy given its obvious problems. And I'm not suggesting we don't have markets, and I'm not suggesting we don't have corporations. But capitalism, again, as I started out with, creates a teleology of capital production rather than social good. So yes, we should have markets, and yes, we should have corporations, but they need to be understood and constituted as tools for serving social and environmental ends, not as ends in themselves. And if I were king of the world, which would not be very democratic, but if I were, I would attach that modifier-ism to the word social instead of to capital.
I should just say we should just open the floor for a question. I don't need to add anything. I do think, though, in the context of our conversation and dialogue, that there's a need to learn from experience because social change and that happens in the context of the current climate we're living in is really important. People need to have hope that we can make a difference and we could reform the system or at least attempt to reform the system. I also believe that we don't have a lot of time on our hands. I say that maybe because I'm a little bit older. And I believe that we've got to give people a sense that they can do small things and sometimes they can do really big things. So I'll tell you a little story. When I was doing the task force on phasing out of coal, we went to a place in Saskatchewan to meet with the workers in the community. It's a small community. It's about 600 people total who lived in the community. And essentially, given I had nothing to do with what we were dealing with, governments had made the decision they were going to basically get rid of the mining of coal in their community. They were going to shut down the coal generation facility, which provided most of the economic benefit that that little community was benefited from over the years. Now, it was interesting. These people didn't do anything wrong. They were not responsible for the problem that we were going to talk about. The Industrial Revolution was based on digging up the coal and creating the Industrial Revolution we all lived in. But here I was going to tell them that most of what they've been doing for the longest period of time is not going to continue. And one of the person on the panel with us told me not to go there because he said, you're not going to like the response. And I said, oh, that's quite harsh. What do you mean? He says, well, they might run you out of town. Given you're not from Saskatchewan, I don't know where you'll run to. But I was co-chairing a task force, and I said, well, you can't write a report about a group of people in their community without actually going to talk to them. But I did go there. And we had a dialogue with 600 individuals, kids, families, about their community. And I said, you know, I want to start to tell you the most honest thing I can tell you. You didn't do anything wrong. You're not responsible for the issue, but what we know from the science of burning coal for human health is not good. For the environment, it's not good. And more importantly, it's not good for the future of the planet. Now, I don't think that to make you feel good, but I'm telling you the truth. The question is, should the companies who have made huge profit from what you have been doing here not have some responsibility to your community? Should government not have some responsibility to your community? Because I know many of you don't want to pack up and go someplace else. We had a most incredible dialogue. But what I saw in my fellow citizens was a sense of hope. It wasn't lost on them that I made all the sense, but I made no sense. Because I was telling them they're going to lose all the good jobs that they have had in their community because this industry is going to die. And what could replace it? My point was the report was about them and about how we can make transformational changes in a moment in history that we have not been afforded. Now, the question, do we have courageous political leaders who can seize the moment? I don't know. Do you have courageous citizens that will take up the fight? And can we build a social movement to create that from to happen? I really don't know. But I think we at least have to give them some tools they can use or work with. And the tools that we may have given them may not be very sharp. They may not be the kind of instrument they need. Maybe they need better instrument in terms of what the law provides. But I do believe it would at least one response is the way how you can deal with a crisis. And I'm talking about a crisis. That we in humanity haven't come to terms with what this planet would look like if we don't change our attitudes and our behavior about the environment which we live in. I know fundamentally corporations cannot solve this problem. It would have to be solved by people and government. They have a responsibility to it. But the bigger question is, I think at the end of the day, is that we should not believe in any form, shape, or way that corporations are going to change their behavior simply because the planet is dying. That's not their endeavor. They never will. I respond. I always says, you know, working people don't get the luxury of packing up and moving someplace else. Rich people do that. They get on a plane and they got well to do it. There's not another planet that I know we can go live on yet. So we have to figure out how to make this one. But my point was in having experienced what I experienced in traveling the country to talking to workers in our community, it gave me hope. By the way, that community provided dinner for me. They made lunch for me. And at the end of the session, we cried together. Because they understood that it wasn't simply about how we can do things better. It was about their kids, whether we can build a different model. So my point was, in absence of actually understanding the role of corporation in all of this, and then try to figure out how you can maybe do some things differently in terms of government responsibility, I think we face a major challenge. And I'll end on this 2 point. The legislation was very kind in a way to ensure workers had a major voice, and that meaning unions. By the way, the unions recognized and they supported the phasing out of coal, even though the majority of their members who work in the industry make anywhere between $60,000 to $100,000 a year. They accepted. They said this is part of our responsibility. But they said we got to figure out what replaces those good jobs. And how do we help these people have better careers, better retirement, and how do we ensure their community survive? We also recognize that the labor movement is only one voice. You have to build a broader social movement if you want to do transformational change. And in the legislation, there's some acknowledgement. It's not just about workers. It's also about the communities and others, First Nation community in this context that could make a difference. So my hopefulness is that we're going to learn much from each other. Each opportunity provides us to learn. And in the context of learning, we should also be able to share as to how we can maybe get to a better place. But I think this current crisis that we're in with the environment also affords this huge opportunity. A poll I looked at very recently evaluate those with the most influence in our society. Corporations had the lowest. As a matter of fact, there was nobody lower than them in the poll in terms of influence. I thought that's quite interesting. How did Canadians get there? My point is our citizens are much smarter than our elected leaders acknowledge. And if they listen to their citizens, they might act accordingly and significant change should come about, in my view.
Toutes ces réflexions d'une richesse inouïe. Maintenant, c'est le moment où vous pouvez poser des questions, partager des commentaires, ou on a envie de faire une minute de silence, tout simplement.
Oui, bonjour, mon nom est Christian Pépin, je suis chercheur à l'Université du Québec en Ottawa, donc merci pour vos présentations. Je voudrais reprendre là où vous avez terminé, Joel, sur à quel point cette révolution légale de l'entreprise ou comment on subordonne l'entreprise à des critères sociaux et environnementaux, est-ce que c'est soluble à l'intérieur du capitalisme? C'est-à-dire, et j'aimerais revenir sur le fait que, Isabelle, vous aviez dit, la gauche, on a beaucoup insisté sur le marché et insuffisamment sur la question de l'entreprise. Je me demande si, avec votre question que vous avez soulevée, si ce n'est pas la discipline de marché qui est aussi le danger ou l'incapacité à rendre ces choses-là solubles. Pourquoi? Parce qu'une des réalités du capitalisme, c'est la mobilité du capital. Et donc, si on introduit une révolution légale au Canada ou aux États-Unis, où on introduit des réglementations sociales, environnementales beaucoup plus fortes, bien, les capitaux, les entreprises vont avoir la capacité à relocaliser leur activité de production. Ils ont la propriété privée des moyens de production. Ils ont un droit de veto qui dit, ben nous, si on sent que cette juridiction-là n'est pas un climat propice au milieu des affaires, on peut relocaliser notre production ailleurs à des endroits qu'on juge plus compétitifs. Et donc, en ce sens-là, la maximisation des profits n'est pas un problème légal, mais résulte de la structure sociale capitaliste auquel chaque entreprise est soumise et mise en compétition. Et donc, la question que je voudrais vous relancer, c'est comment être capable de rendre ça soluble si on ne change pas fondamentalement cette structure sociale-là qui met en relation compétitive les entreprises? Est-ce qu'on ne va être pas pris avec le problème des délocalisations ou des chantages à la délocalisation? Et donc, peut-être creuser cette question-là sur à quel point que la question du marché, on peut l'oublier dans l'équation.
Thank you so much for your intervention. I had a question first for Professor Bacon. So you said we need to work on the firm, and you mentioned maybe we need to change the objective of the firm, adding something to profit. And my question is, even though I agree it's an important change, there is also something about the very structure of the firm and how we understand first the ownership of the firm and who control the firm based on that ownership. And I feel like that there is this question of adding new purpose to firm. It has been done in several jurisdictions. I'm thinking of France right now who has done that recently. But there is the risk that it's just adding another layer, which would be marginal in the end, and it wouldn't mean actually working on the firm. And so I wanted to hear you maybe on, beside those adding objective to the firm, what do you think we can do more profoundly on the very structure of the corporation? And the second thing, maybe quickly, I wanted to say, to Mr. Lussier and the Honorable Senator Yussuff is that I think we all know policymaking is hard, and I hear that maybe academic spheres might be thinking too highly about some stuff and not concretely enough. I think first that there is maybe even more now the need that there is discussion between those spheres if we want to understand each other and the way we think. And secondly, also, we were thinking about adding new elements to the law. But let me remind you that there are many actual labor rights that are under attack right now all over the world. And I'm thinking about the simple right to bargain collectively, freedom of association, and even the right to strike. And maybe I want to hear you what you think about. Maybe we can't add new layers right now, but maybe what you can do is actually protect fundamentally those rights that are so important to our democracy in general. And so I wanted to hear you maybe on that. Thank you.
Si, une dernière. Donc, c'était Charles Lurquin de l'Université McGill.
Thank you so much. I'm going to go in the same direction as not going to tie you to common good capitalism or even common good socialism, but I'm asking you to say if we have a ratchet strategy where you're looking to push things in the right direction and give people tools which will help them to take it in the right direction, what would be one or two steps that you would propose? In other words, what gives people steps? I don't think we're going, from now until the 15th of December to the bicameral firm, but because I don't know what it could be, but I'm very interested in saying, okay, this gives you tools. And I know that both Jérôme and Hassan are obviously thinking about tools, but the legislation remains fairly abstract. So in that sense, we're saying, what gives people something that they can use to take two steps further?
Nah, sorry. I'm struck by two things. One is the continued ignoring of the law by firms, as demonstrated so eloquently in the book. Love the movie too. And I'm also struck by some recent developments in Australia, which most people here would not be aware of, that of a union, a trade union, which has been alleged and probably is corrupt and involved in organised crime and has been the subject of a lot of political controversy over the years, has been put by a federal Labor government into administration. And administration is a tool normally reserved for companies that basically go into huge financial difficulties, probably going broke. And this has also, of course, caused huge schisms within the union movement as to whether this is an undemocratic process, whatever. I'm wondering, to what extent would the threat of administration be a more real threat to firms than repeatedly threatening to fine them, given that usually they ignore them and no government seems willing to impose big enough fines to make them change their behaviour. And also there's too much resistance because if a firm goes bust, it creates holes in supply chains, causes huge problems for customers, the workers don't like it, massive controversy with administrators. You put somebody from outside in charge of running the firm and it basically continues to operate in its existing niche, but operate more in line with the law. Is this combined with the idea of giving the firm more objectives than just purely making profit? Is this a potential way forward?
Sorry. Thank you very much. That was by far the best that I've heard today. I really, really enjoyed it. It was great. But if you take, for instance, if you look at Marx and his theory of the logic of capital, you're never going to go beyond the fact that the system is one of exploitation. And it's always going to be. It comes in cycles, the cycles change. I mean, talking about Roosevelt, that was fantastic. But what happened? You know, it went under. So surely there has to be an end to the, I mean, is really, can we be optimistic that capitalism is ever going to ultimately give us a system of social justice or socialism, like you say? Or is it that capitalism is ultimately doomed to exploit, and it's endemic to its very fabric and its logic? It's very pessimistic, sorry.
I mean, I'll take I mean, you're all asking the same question. And I mean, I think that the question is encapsulated in the last comment. I mean, the reason why firms are incentivized to leave domestic places and go to other places is because they're driven by the profit imperative. The problems with the structure of the firm, while there are problems other than just capital production, like hierarchy, like the maldistribution of liability, like the fact that directors and managers can escape liability from law, like the fact that shareholders enjoy limited liability. I mean, there are all kinds of ways that we can talk about the structure of the firm as leading to negligence and profusion. And when I say those words, negligence and profusion, and attach them to large corporations, I'm quoting Adam Smith. So, so yeah, for sure. And we definitely need various new tools. In terms of the international domestic thing, I mean, the obvious answer to that is protectionism, but not the kind of protectionism that that Donald Trump is talking about, but protectionism that actually is designed to protect. And the other answer to it is international organizations and agreements and law. That in order to even the playing field and to ensure that we can't have this kind of capital mobility as a way of seeking easier externalization by going to other jurisdictions, you know, that's what the ILO is all about. That's what it's supposed to be about. Gets to the point of freedom of association. I mean, the Freedom of Association Committee is quite progressive, and we have quite a few Canadian cases that have gone up there, but it happens at a very piecemeal level. I'm writing a paper right now about gig workers and the fact that they're excluded from collective bargaining regimes. I mean, you're absolutely right. It's a huge issue. And you're also absolutely right that it's not just about creating new layers, but it's about taking the actual laws that we have and that corporations so easily escape and enforcing them. But anyways, I could go on and on and on, so I'm going to stop and pass it on.
Thank you. I might answer this question in English just because some of the questions were asked in English, and I think some of the examples I want to give are also from the Anglo sphere. Quick responses. What can we do to move forward? I'm going to speak a little bit from a political and legislative perspective, but certainly one thing that helps, especially in small jurisdictions like Canada and even Quebec even more, is other examples. We are not a courageous jurisdiction. We need to rely on what others do. So we have been invoking the British Better Business Act as much as we could to say, look, we're not crazy, they're doing it. And we've been quoting people in New York and everywhere else. We've been citing La Loi Pacte in France to say, well, they're moving in that direction. We've been citing Le Rapport Sénat-Nota. We've been trying to invoke everything we could internationally to put pressure on our own constituents to say, look, you can take this next step. So that helps. Capital mobility, huge issue. Always the first thing that we are told when we talk about our bill, yeah, well, every company is going to leave. We don't think that's true. First, because some companies, it's imperfect, but you know, B Corps and benefit corporations are certainly trying to put that model forward. I'm not saying it's the solution, but they're at least, they're not all bankrupt and they're doing it. And some of the local Quebec companies, I would point you to Optel and Nordastelo. They're two large companies, and they're doing okay. And I think they are at least trying to move in that direction. They haven't gone bankrupt yet. The other thing we can say is that if the world is heading in that direction, then maybe there isn't such a risk for us to be doing the same thing. The European Union certainly moving towards mandatory impact disclosure. That's an important part, I think, from a transparency perspective, which is the 0 level. Quick response on receivership or outside administration. One example that I have found fascinating, we didn't mention it because it would scare people too much, but in my own thinking, the sanction for not respecting your corporate purpose as redefined in the law would be open to a judge hearing the case, of course. But the preferred sanction, as far as I'm concerned, is what courts did in the Purdue Pharma case in the US, where the company was essentially forced to reincorporate essentially as a nonprofit, meaning that the jobs are saved, whatever good the company was doing continues. You're not destroying the fabric of that entity, but you're essentially wiping out shareholders and transforming in that corporation into an institution for the public good. It's the nuclear option, of course, but it should certainly be on the table. If you violate the fundamental purpose that you're designed to serve, you're dead. You become a nonprofit. And they did it in the Purdue Pharma case. Maybe others could be inspired by this.
Merci beaucoup. Well, I finish up in English then. So with two thoughts. The first one is that the point of the most advanced democratized corporate form that we know under capitalism, which is the German case, is actually the one that has been hailed for precisely retaining capital in its investments, and it's been the envy of all the other countries in Europe, because Germany has indeed been able to keep a very strong industrial sector. So that is part of the story, I think. And then the second point I want to make is that when you think about it in a sort of a larger frame, if really truly we can all agree, and I think even people in corporations today, when you hear them, they tell you that what they would need is proper environmental regulation, so that, you know, the good player could do what they have to do, and not be debased by the bad players. So you can very frequently hear CEOs arguing for regulations on many levels, and I don't think that's only talk. I think they truly believe that it would help them to focus on their business, on innovation, at the levels that we really want firms to innovate. And so for that, I mean, based on that, we can really see there is a need, even recognized within capitalism, I would say, or within capitalist actors, for basically regaining public capabilities, state-level capabilities, and of course at the highest level, up to there, to tackle climate change. We need public-level capabilities at the global level also. And I think that the plan to get there, I mean, I don't see many plans currently, and there are not many options, in fact. In actually democratizing firms, this is what we have to understand also, is that democratizing firms, but not sugarcoating things, right? So truly putting an opposite power within the corporation to reorient the objectives of the firm by granting workers the ability to defend their own views about the finality of the firms, the means that needs to be deployed. To do that would actually trigger a totally different relationship between firms and the state, because that is the only way I can see through which we could actually regain a much more mutually beneficial relationship between firms and states. And this is what, at the end of the day, we absolutely badly need. So thank you.
Thanks. In 1982, when Canada repatriated its constitution, workers would not even recognize of having any fundamental rights in the constitution. But workers didn't accept that. It took many years of litigation to the courts, and finally the Supreme Court ruled the right to strike is a fundamental right. Similarly, on the issue of collective bargaining was not recognized as protected under the Constitution. Again, workers took their struggle. Eventually, the courts ruled that the right to bargain is a fundamental right. In our country, the state didn't give that to working people. They advance and they struggle now. At the same time, does not mean the government haven't passed law to take away those rights. And my view is simple, is that at some point the court's going to have to rule. If it is a fundamental right, what is the price for taking it away or suspending it? I think there are some cases that will evolve back to the courts where the court's going to have to define. And I hope the courts will be definitive in saying, if it is a fundamental right, then it is a fundamental right. The only way you can get rid of a fundamental right, I guess, you could override the Constitution before you pass the law, if that is allowed, and that way you can do it. So in the context of your point, workers still have to struggle to ensure that the victories they win is not muted or mitigated by the powers that be at whatever moment in history. But I think in the broader question about something we can use, on this question of sustainability, I think because we're a federation in this country, a government was to pass legislation to impart us that every workplace needs to have a sustainable plan. If there's a union, they will give that meaning in their own way by taking it up and say, well, what is our plan? How do we participate in a process to do so? But even if there isn't, that they have to file it so we would know what it is. I think it forced citizens to get involved. As we know, things don't simply happen. People do take up issues and try to champion them in a way. They're small things, but I think they're significant in a way to give people some opportunity. In this period we're living in, for instance, and I always try to understand what is the outcome of this. BlackRock Capital is not the only one, but says they will not lend their money to anybody that's involved in activities that is against the environment to a large extent. Now, not sure we're going to go out and celebrate that, but it is a significant shift in thinking that to say, well, something has to be done. Certain aspects of capital is recognizing that, they shouldn't foster bad behavior. But the bigger challenge, what is the role in the state? And in legislating to say, well, hang on a minute. Yeah, this is an important point, because if we are to meet a certain goal by a certain time frame, it will take a huge effort. And simply relying on voluntary measures to get there is not going to get there. And I think it's critical in the context of what BlackRock is doing is that it's begging the question, what is the role in the state in this discussion? Because the state do regulate what goes on in the stock markets and whatever, and it's not, you're not saying, hey, you shouldn't lend money. Simply say you shouldn't lend money for certain things. I think reform does come about to a large extent. Now, we do live in a federation, and I always says, the point that somebody says, well, lawmaking is a very long process. Yeah, you can get very old trying to change laws. I know from some of my hairs that I've lost and grays that I have. But the reality is that lawmaking is also an exciting way to provide for activists to show you can actually have meaningful victories. in things that are central to their effort to make society a better place. So, you know, I think we're all saying the same thing, but equally, I think there's a recognition that start from the question, can capital be reformed to have a sense of justice and responsibility? I don't know, maybe I'm too old and not so cynical, but I think any effort is worth trying. As I always says, you know, I remind my young daughter that you may not change the world, but one act of courage might lead to some change.
Je vous remercie énormément chacun de nos panélistes. Vous avez vu quelle richesse. Merci à vous dans l'auditoire d'avoir été là. Merci ceux en ligne. On est désolé de ne pas pouvoir prendre plus de questions. On aurait passé toute la soirée, puis peut-être qu'on serait arrivé à la solution, mais on va vous laisser continuer à discuter parmi vous. Joignez-vous à moi pour remercier une dernière fois nos panélistes.